So I'm sure you're probably aware that I've done a few pieces of content now involving Windows codename Longhorn, the ill-fated successor to Windows XP. And viewers that have been around even longer than that may remember that I tried to cover Longhorn somewhat seriously in a series I quickly deleted because I realized it wasn't very good. Well, I still wanted to do something involving Longhorn that wasn't just me trying to do stupid stuff with it. So I've got a different idea. Today, we are going to, well, I don't know why I said we. I am going to install every single build of Windows codename Longhorn on a real computer, and I'm going to do the best to my ability to explain each build. Seems like a simple task, right? No, it doesn't. I don't even know why I included this line. There are 46 different builds of Windows Longhorn that have been leaked. There are probably even more. In other words, I'm probably going to lose my mind by the end of this. At the time of editing, I hope to God that this is not going to be the final length, but my current rough draft is 4 hours for this video. So I think it goes without saying this is the biggest video I've ever done. This video is only going to cover pre-reset Longhorn, also known as the stuff that Longhorn was supposed to be. As I'm sure you're probably aware, Longhorn's development went so poorly that it was actually reset back in August of 2004, so technically there are two halves to Windows Vista. As long as people don't completely hate this video, I probably will do a sequel involving post-reset Windows Vista, but this video would be like 20 hours long if I did both in one, so we're gonna stick to the pre-reset stuff for today. I am not the best explainer, but I feel like it's appropriate to at least have some context for the Longhorn project and how this is going to work. Longhorn was the code name for what was supposed to be the next version of Windows after Windows XP, which was codenamed Whistler. And then all of that would be followed up by Blackcomb, which was supposed to be the next major release. Longhorn was supposed to be a minor release, but the more you start to look at the builds and look at the things that were introduced, you'll quickly realize that was never going to be the case. Its development was very complicated. That's probably the nice way to put it. And so a lot of these builds are a complete mess. Something that is very important to consider if you're going to run any build of Longhorn on a real computer at all is what you're using, because Longhorn sucks. It's buggy and slow. If you try and run it on something from 2001 when Windows XP came out, you're not going to have a good time. So the system of choice is one that I've actually recently covered. It's my Gateway E4100 from mid-2004. In regards to the timeline of this video, this computer was manufactured at the end of Longhorn's development, but when taking into account the post-reset Windows Vista stuff that occurred after 2004, this computer lands about in the middle of that transition period. As for the relevant hardware specs for this video, this system uses an Intel Pentium 4 HT CPU clocked at a whole 3 GHz. It's a Northwood CPU. This also has an NVIDIA GeForce FX 5200, something that will be very important later. 4 gigs of RAM, complete overkill. This also has some creative audio card, and it has a 250 gig IDE hard drive. Yeah, it's not the best system it can run on, but I was trying to go for something that would, actually work. Something else to note is that this video took so long to film that some of the hardware in the computer is different from the beginning of the video compared to what it was at the end. It doesn't ultimately matter, the overall system is exactly the same, but if you see some discrepancies, that's why. I installed a clean copy of Windows XP on this computer, so that way there was a base for me to install over. Because there's so many builds, I decided to extract the files of every ISO, and I'm going to be copying the files direct to the hard drive, so that I don't have to use like 50 disks. So, the earliest leaked build of Longhorn, we're going to go in the order of oldest first, was build 3683, a jump in the build number of over 1,000. This build was compiled on September 23rd, 2002. It leaked 2 months later in November of 2002 by a group called Xbetas. Yeah. In any normal Windows development, there are usually leaked builds from right around the time of development starting, and so the earliest leaked build of a new version of Windows would have literally no changes at all. But Longhorn is not normal, and so that's not the case, because this build takes place 11 months after Windows XP was released. So there is a lot going on in this build. In fact, this is one of the busiest builds of Longhorn at all. It doesn't look that way at first because the setup utility and boot screen are pretty much identical to Windows XP's other than an updated copyright date on the boot screen. The out-of-box experience is also the same, except for whatever reason the out-of-box experience was updated to No Hey Problema by Pink Martini, a Windows Server quirk. The fun stuff begins when we get to the logon screen. The color scheme has been changed on what is otherwise the Windows XP logon screen, and the date and time is now displayed in the top right corner. The Windows XP Bliss wallpaper has been replaced with a Longhorn branded thing with some hay bales, because nothing screams Longhorn more than hay bales. There's a couple other minor quirks. The Windows XP Professional watermark has been changed to Longhorn XP Professional, and the flag on the start button is all white rather than the colorful one in basically every other version of Windows before this. However, there's been another major UI change in this build. We'll get to this later. There is an entire new theme that's been added called Plex. This was only a temporary theme until they could get a new one working later, and you'll see what that is. There are some problems with this theme, notably the colors are all over the place. It's an even lighter shade of blue than the Luna theme in Windows XP, but as it was refined in later builds, it looked a lot better. When right-clicking on the taskbar and bringing up the taskbar and Start Menu Properties window, there is an option in the Notification Area section to enable a sidebar. Look familiar? Obviously, this is nowhere near what the sidebar in Windows Vista would end up being. You can toggle the transparency of the bar, the side that it's displayed on, if the taskbar is part of the sidebar, and you can unlock it and resize it. Pretty standard stuff. And in this build, gadgets were called tiles, and there are 7 out of the box. A clock, a desktop manager, most frequently used, quick launch, search, slideshow, and user tile. You can resize each tile, though some won't have any resizing options. They can also be moved up and down, and you can remove them. As in my case, there's not enough room for all of them. Most of these are about what you would expect. Probably the biggest exception of all of these is the Desktop Manager, a feature that would end up in Windows 10 later. It doesn't really work that well, and it uses a ton of resources. There are 2 hidden tiles that require the registry editor, People Tile and Dig Clock. The People Tile is a contacts tile, which also doesn't really work, and Dig Clock is a digital clock. As for Explorer, there's also a lot going on here. The Explorer sidebar has a new color scheme to kind of match the Plex theme, and there's also a search box. Drives have colored bars to indicate how much free space is left. There is a new preview pane, which is kind of glitchy, a new zoom slider, and pivots, a feature that relies on WinFS, a new storage system present in this build. In the simplest of terms, this basically was a new way, a better way, to group certain files on the system into certain categories based on a certain quality. I have no idea how it works. There is no UI for it, and so the only real way you would know it's there is if the system was using a lot of resources. As of right now, there are pivots for documents, music, and pictures. Again, with various qualities for each of those different types of files. And it does work. It's just very slow. Speaking of WinFS stuff, in the Start menu customization options, there's the ability to enable a hidden My Contacts page. This is pretty self-explanatory. You can store contacts in here. You can make a new one and add a new contact, and this is where the People tile pulls its data from. In the Start menu, there's a new My Hardware page as well. Doesn't rely on WinFS. Instead, this is supposed to be a more modern and simple version of Device Manager. The only things actually present though are audio, input, network, video, and other devices, so not very useful right now. We're still not quite done with Explorer changes yet. There is a Media Explorer bar in this build, which as far as I'm aware seems like a inbuilt media player for Windows Explorer. Obviously it's got buttons, but it's not that useful otherwise. You can also make a photo album or a playlist, but you can't actually do anything with them. You can just look at them. Anyway, getting back to something earlier, when you right click and open properties, you might notice there's a new display properties dialog in this build. This relies on Avalon, a codename for the Windows Presentation Foundation, a subsystem that uses .NET framework for basically more advanced and modern UI designs compared to the old stuff. This display properties window was supposed to replace the old school Windows XP and before window that had been used. Obviously, it's very buggy. The desktop background section is the only one that really seems to work, and there's some pretty cool things in there, like the ability to set a gradient and a photo collage. The rest of it doesn't really work very well. It's probably a good thing that there's a shortcut for the, in its own words, classic display control panel. Moving on, there's a Windows component that can be installed in this build called Freestyle. By installing this, the system automatically freaks out over a license violation, and files on the installation media are required for Media Center, which was not previously in Windows before, other than in its own separate version. This changes the boot screen from Professional to Freestyle, and the watermark from Longhorn XP Professional to Longhorn XP Media Center Edition. The actual Media Center program doesn't work. It just crashes right away. This build also contains a game manager, or at least parts of one. Explorer can read GDF files, or game definition files, and I was able to download a sample file provided by longhorn.ms, a very useful website. Obviously it doesn't actually load anything, but the preview pane at least displays info related to how this may have been laid out. Additionally, this command can invoke a My Games News window. Once again, not at all useful. And finally, the last major thing I want to show in this build is called DCE, or Desktop Composition Engine. It's not attached to the UI at all and requires the registry editor. By setting the dword value to 1, it will automatically start when the system is booted and run all of the time. And by setting it to 2, it can be run manually, which is what I elected to do instead. What this does is make every window fully transparent. This is why that FX5200 is relevant, because you need a decent enough GPU to be able to run this. This was part of the new user interface ambitions that they had planned for Longhorn. It'll develop more over time, but right now it's not very useful. In fact, if anything, while it looks cool, kind of hard to actually use a lot of windows, because it's not like there's any blurring or anything. It's just overlaying windows on top of one another. Because there are both hardware and software components, it's pretty intensive on both the GPU and the CPU. There's a lot of other smaller changes that I just haven't gotten into, frankly, to save time. But there's stuff like adding ratings to music files, a new briefcase introduction dialog, a new startup applications monitor, and a new open/save dialog in Paint. They're not in every program. Also, Paint causes an error when you close it. A couple other things, DirectX 9 is now included out of the box, and Internet Explorer was updated to version 6.05. Just over 1 month later, on October 29th, build 3706 was compiled. This one also appears to have been around for a pretty long time, leaking in May of 2006. It's a lot of the same story with this build, not much is different on the surface. To me, this build feels like more of a realignment build, if you will. Realignment towards reality. Some things like the Plex theme have been cleaned up in this build, but there are also a surprisingly and perhaps an alarming amount of features that were introduced in 3683 that are absent in this build. We'll talk more about that a little later. Since I upgraded from build 3683, all of my settings are exactly the same, including the logon screen Control-Alt-Delete setting, which was actually introduced in the last build, but that I just didn't mention until now. One of the biggest changes on the surface is that the taskbar is now part of the sidebar. Now that's not a new thing, that was introduced in the last build, but in this build, there's no way to turn that off. You can set the taskbar on the bottom, but the start menu is still part of the sidebar. It's really weird. So maybe this feature was supposed to replace the traditional taskbar entirely, but to be honest, at least in this interpretation, I don't like this at all. So since there aren't really any other obvious changes to the sidebar or its tiles, I ended up just disabling the sidebar entirely. Like I said earlier, there have been some changes to the Plex theme. In particular, the text is actually readable on the start menu, and the taskbar itself is a slightly darker shade of blue, which looks better. In Windows Explorer, the placement of the pivots feature has moved, so now instead of being next to the preview pane, the individual pivots themselves are located on the sidebar as other places, and the relevant ones for music or pictures show up depending on whatever folder you're in. My Contacts also has a people picker now, if you want to add existing contacts, which feels a lot like an Avalon wizard. And there's a new Contacts import wizard, which is neither Avalon nor the old style. It's a hybrid. Additionally, the My Hardware page introduced in the last build has a lot more hardware in it now. In Control Panel, there's an option for a download manager, which does a whole lot of nothing. Now let's go back to some features from the last build. The ability to open GDF files is gone, though the My Games News window still opens pretty much the same as it does in the last build. The new display properties is disabled by default, though it can be re-enabled in the registry editor. And there have been a couple changes to this actually, other than some of the text problems. Specifically, the desktop background section is even more useless. But there have been some display settings options as well. And for my testing, it actually does work, so I'm gonna leave that alone. Media Center is also present in this build, but it's exactly the same as it was in the last build, so it doesn't work at all. However, buried in the System32 folder is a program called My TV App. This opens the Windows Trust Manager, which I read is supposed to be in the last build, but I couldn't figure out a way to trigger it. But again, look familiar at all? The My TV app is a TV app. My guess is this was supposed to be a component to Windows Media Center, a separate program or Explorer window or something like that. It's hard to really speculate because none of it's actually usable at all. but this program was built using Avalon, and it probably would have been a TV recording manager program thing. I don't know. And finally, last but not least, DCE, which is different in this build in that it's actually part of the UI now. You can enable it in the advanced display properties. However, it doesn't work. On an NVIDIA machine, like mine, it will cause a blue screen in the nv4 disp.dll file. And from my experience on ATI and Intel graphics chipsets, it just doesn't work at all. Oh, I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but this build has a new wallpaper as well. Replaces the hay bales thing from the last build with a more blue horn wallpaper. I guess it matches the theme at least. Just over 2 weeks later, build 3713 was compiled. It was uploaded to Beta Archive in 2011. This build did have some file copying problems, which I'm sure definitely won't come up later. And it had some more errors on the desktop upon logging in. The taskbar and sidebar are now two different things again, which is good. There's also a new selection of default sidebar tiles, though hilariously, none of the old tiles were removed because I did an upgrade, so even though some tiles were renamed, the old versions are also still there. There's also a tray icons tile and a Windows Media Player tile, and if I re-enable the taskbar option, there is a whole new taskbar that is present in this build, without any tray icons or anything, so the good thing they added that tile, I suppose. The start menu has some new default links out of the box for libraries, like the picture and video library. My Contacts now has a new preview banner background, and My Hardware also shows devices that are not currently connected to the computer, which I think is kind of cool. You may have noticed that the Explorer sidebar is entirely different compared to what was introduced in 3683. That's because the traditional sidebar has been replaced with the WinFS sidebar. Now that's fine, except the legacy options for showing and hiding system files are not present, so you'd either have to unhide them in folder options or disable it entirely using the registry editor. In this build, the freestyle components are present, but in addition to that, there are also tablet PC components that are present in this build. Now, remember those file copying errors from earlier? Well, they were media center files. Basically, it was trying to copy files from build 3706 rather than 3713. I tried pointing them to the right files, but it didn't seem to work because now the program doesn't open at all and its version is 6.0.3706. The MyTV app does at least have a shortcut in the start menu now. It opens the Windows Trust Manager once again, this time in a much bigger window and with some broken text. Otherwise, it's the same as before. As for the tablet PC components, like with Media Center, they're pretty much brought over from the tablet PC version of Windows XP. There's an on-screen keyboard now on startup, as well as a beta version of the tablet PC input panel and a tablet computing demo. It also enables ClearType, a sticky notes program is present, as well as the Windows Journal, though it doesn't open at all. And finally, Inkball. Though since it was ripped straight from the tablet PC version, it expects you're using a pen, so it's really tough to play with a mouse. Additionally, DCE finally works in this build. Again. And additionally, there are new animations for minimizing a window and closing a window. They don't work all the time though, only sometimes. 6 days later, on November 19th, the final Milestone 3 build was compiled, build 3718, which was leaked in 2004. This build has very little that's actually different from build 3713. Notably, the installation, specifically the completing installation phase of Windows setup, had some problems with some Visual Studio files, specifically throwing errors, which was odd. Otherwise, it's much of the same. DCE works a little bit better in this build, but doesn't really say a whole lot now, does it? Longhorn entered its Milestone 4 phase with the compilation of build 4001, compiled on December 4th. Incidentally, this is the final build compiled in 2002. And this one was leaked in 2013. And before I get into anything else, there's a very significant change with this build. The installer is totally different. This is because this is the first build of Windows that uses the new Windows image-based install system. The setup utility is extremely basic, as you would expect. It only includes just enough functions to get Windows installed. So for example, there's no option to upgrade to this build, because it just wasn't implemented. Now, if you couldn't tell, there was a pretty big jump in the build number for this build. And that's because work on Server 2003 was getting close to being finished. So this is the first main branch build of Longhorn, since they moved on from Server 2003 stuff. Anyway, the new installation system has 2 phases mainly. It has a copying/expanding Windows files phase, it reboots, and then has to do hardware detection. The whole point of all this was mainly to make Windows installation a lot easier and faster. The old cab-based builds of Longhorn took a really long time to install, so it was just a good idea to come up with something better. There's also a new redesigned out-of-box experience in this build, though the only feature is it lets you make a user account. And all of this ended up not mattering at all because there was a problem with this installation. Because this installer is either just bugged or extremely basic, there is a problem with the partitioning section where if you have any space at the beginning of the drive at all, regardless if you have an existing partition you're running from, it will just install to that empty space. So I now have 2 Windows installs on this computer because this hard drive had a recovery partition on it that I deleted initially so that it wouldn't try to install to it. And now it has used that space to make its own partition. One big change over the old cab system that Windows had used up until now is that rather than deleting the old Windows folder, it simply renames it and just creates an entire new one. So you can still access files from the old Windows install. It also doesn't delete the Windows install files at all, so you can still boot back into the pre-installation environment, but I think that's likely just a mistake. Otherwise, the only notable thing I found is that WinFS is totally absent in this build, or at least it doesn't work. The first Longhorn build, compiled in 2003, was build 4002, compiled on January the 8th, specifically. This build was leaked in 2020, so not that long ago, and it uses Old Familiar. This is because this is a Lab 06 build, 4001 was a main build, so different code bases. So the new setup wasn't in this build. I would say it would be for the best, except this build also had file copying problems. The setup doesn't even properly load because of coverage.dll. Setup can be invoked by running the WinNT32 executable, but still kind of strange. And from what I've read, it also has problems when you are clean installing it, so you can't format a hard drive at all. Additionally, there's some file copying errors in this build as well, specifically to do with WinFS. So, looks like that's not working in this build either. Additionally, my GPU is not working in this build either. I'm not sure why, but my video driver just completely broke in this build. Like, it said it was still working, but the colors were absolutely awful. Long story short, I had to load a different driver on here, and that seemed to solve the problem. There's also a problem with wcmregister.exe, so every time the system boots, there's this user registration failure. There's also no sidebar tiles out of the box, but there is at least an animation now for adding or removing a tile. This build has a new Milestone 4 wallpaper, still pretty basic. As I predicted, WinFS is totally non-functional, but at least there's a new preview pane, which is intentionally left blank. There's a new sharing wizard in this build, which can be enabled by, ironically, disabling the simple file share wizard option in folder options. Also, this is the last build of pre-reset Longhorn that has the Media Center and tablet PC components with the ISO, as far as I'm aware anyway, and because I had to reinstall this because of 4001's nonsense, it means that I actually can open Media Center in this build. This was supposed to work in 3713, but it didn't, though that's mostly a me problem because I upgraded from the last build, and it works perfectly fine. This is a version of Media Center I don't recognize, so maybe it was a beta version from the Windows XP Media Center Edition 2002, I'm not entirely sure. It doesn't run that great. It also wasn't meant for a widescreen display at all, but it does work. For the most part. Okay. Yeah, the MyTV app appears to be broken in this build. Really, there just appears to be a lot of text problems with Avalon-related things. Finally, I found out that there are some hidden tiles present in this build. You need the registry editor for this. The Windows Media Player tile is back. There's also a tile for Internet Webcam, Longhorn Status, and RMA Test. The Media Player tile is exactly as it was in 3713, so not really usable at all. The Internet Webcam tile supposedly has a URL for a Washington Department of Transportation CTV camera. So obviously this doesn't work without any internet anyway. Longhorn Status has a URL for an internal Microsoft site, so it's not actually something you can load. And RMA Test tile doesn't do anything, it's just a Longhorn clock. 20 days later, on January 28th, build 4005 was compiled, and this build was also leaked in 2020, around the same time as 4002. And the new Windows image-based setup utility is back, and this time it's a lot more proper looking. It includes the ability to upgrade now, and you can install it on an existing partition without it completely messing up and just installing wherever it feels like. This build reintroduces the ability to show or hide a hidden folder. The download manager also has these sorting tabs now. The WinVer banner has been changed to a more Plex themed looking one. For some reason, the copyright date is 2006. Strangely, this would later be extremely accurate though. Additionally, the default screensaver has been changed to a Longhorn 1. And the hidden tiles from the last build are also present in this build as well, except the Longhorn Status tile is absent. Otherwise, the Internet Webcam, RMA Test, and Windows Media Player tiles are still here, and they all function about the same. The next build, 4008, was compiled on February 19th, my birthday. Don't I feel special? This build was leaked just 9 days later on February 28th, so that's not a lot of time. Now there's a pretty interesting problem when you upgrade from a previous build to this one, which is that it pretty much entirely breaks the theming in this build. This is a shame because there actually are some taskbar changes in this build, but I can't show them because, well, you know. The sidebar now has an options tile, which is basically just the same menu if you right-clicked on the sidebar. There's a new notification style in this build. There's bigger text and there is a timer on it, and when that timer expires, the notification goes away. If you hover over the notification, the timer pauses. So if you want to see a notification, you can, and if you don't, it'll go away. It's kind of clever. The preview pane in Explorer has been redesigned again. Additionally, the categorization is different in Explorer, so now libraries are displayed in the My Computer section, and the shared documents and your user documents, they've been pushed to the bottom. The banners for various file types seem to be designed kind of like the My Contacts one that was introduced many builds ago, but it's still very much a placeholder. The My Hardware page has been renamed to Hardware and Devices, and it also displays the CPU in the computer, which really seems to confirm that this was probably supposed to be a replacement for Device Manager entirely. Control Panel also has an option for parental controls, which has been added to this build. There's only two options: choosing an internet program for parental controls, which doesn't do anything, and changing the hours a user can log on. This can be applied to the guest account, which is how I'm demonstrating this. When you try and log on at a time other than what's specified, normally it's supposed to bring up a dialog box, but for my testing, it just seems to lock you out and claim there's a password on the account. Now finally, the hidden tiles in this build, the same three in the last build, are present. Longhorn status is back, and there is now a messenger status tile, which does nothing because the version of Windows Messenger pre-installed is not the right version. You're supposed to run 4.6, and the one that's included is not that. Seems kind of like a really strange oversight. Now there's one last thing with this build that I have noticed can occasionally happen, and it's kind of a big problem, which is that occasionally if you upgrade to this build, it will completely nuke your user account. There should only be two here: my old user account from XP and the new user account from 4001. I've upgraded from all these builds, but you can see there's a new administrator account. This just happened when I restarted the computer. The next time it came back on, well, my whole user account was completely reset back to defaults, and I couldn't load my old one anymore. I'm not sure why this happens. I've never seen it happen anywhere else. It's only been in my testing. But it's definitely strange. Anyway, the final milestone 4 build of Longhorn at the moment is build 4011. And this build has a unique thing about it because the installer for it doesn't work. This is because, apparently, according to the Beta Wiki article for this build, quote, "This build's Win32k.sys contains issues that prevent proper operation within the pre-installation environment, resulting in failed system installation attempts. To resolve this problem, a previous version of Win32k.sys is required, which must be implemented by booting the installation media using standard PC mode configuration." Sure. So I'm not sure if this issue affects only the pre-installation environment or if it's any different by installing it within Windows. It doesn't matter because I don't have that copy of the build. The one that I found is an i386 repack, presumably to fix this problem so that you can actually install it. So because of that, the setup is just all weird, and it was clearly meant to be used by booting directly off of the media. Unfortunately, because this is a modified ISO, it's more than the size of a CD. And I don't have any DVDs in the house. So we're gonna have to cheat a little. So the installer for build 4011 is a bit interesting here. You can see that it was sort of like they kind of tried to make it fit. They at least put the Longhorn background in here. When I put this in a virtual machine, it installed with no issue at all. It brings up the Windows XP out-of-box experience, which I'm guessing is not normal. It's just a side effect of this installer. So you can see the taskbar differences that I kind of talked about in 4008. Particularly the text on the start button is weird. It doesn't look right. It now uses the Arial font instead of Franklin Gothic. There's a new taskbar settings window present in this build. It simply allows you to reposition either the taskbar or the sidebar on any direction you want, replacing the drop-down menus that were present before. It kind of works, but not very well. The only other thing of note is that the preview panes are a bit different in this build. Some of them, like My Documents, are a bit proper looking. For a lot of the libraries, it's basically using the old graphics just pasted on the new preview pane. Longhorn entered its Milestone 5 phase with the compilation of build 4015 on March 28, 2003. Otherwise, the only thing unique to this build is that it didn't work. It caused a 7B blue screen. Apparently, this can happen if an IDE hard drive is used. So I actually had to swap the drive for a SATA drive. Luckily I had one that was exactly the same capacity, so I could just copy everything over real quickly. And although it took an uncomfortable amount of time to load, it did eventually continue setup. Otherwise, the only other thing of note is that in the second sort of, I don't know what you call it, hardware detection phase, it specifically says that it's doing plug and play detection. This build has a new logon screen, which replaces the old temp one that was introduced all the way back in 3683. It's very simple. It feels very Longhorn-y. Is that a word? Interestingly, you can set a custom background image by making a change in the registry. There's a new Longhorn Milestone 5 wallpaper, which looks pretty much the same as the Milestone 4 wallpaper. The new taskbar is enabled by default as well. There's a new synchronized tile in this build, which doesn't really do anything. And there's also a basket tile in this build. The taskbar and start menu properties window has been changed. There's a sidebar/taskbar tab and a positions tab where you can change the, well, positions of the sidebar and taskbar. In the start menu, the username text is a lot bigger. Explorer has been redesigned again. There's a new preview pane again, except for the My Contacts one, which is still the same legacy one that was basically introduced at the start. But something that is kind of interesting with Explorer is that the traditional properties dialog has been replaced with the version that's built into Explorer. It opens like a web page. It's kind of interesting. My Contacts has a couple more options now, and there's also a quick link for personal contacts. The start menu has a shortcut for a game library, which is supposed to load things, but on this install didn't do anything. Hardware and devices also has significantly less devices. In control panel, the parental controls option has another option that's been added to it. You can limit the games a user can play. The My TV app might be gone, but in this build, there is a new help place buried in the Windows folder. Like with My TV app, this opens the Windows Trust Manager, which has seen yet another redesign. This is supposed to be a new help and support center, I guess to replace the Windows XP one. The funny thing is that this is actually a template for a Dell computer, in this case a Dimension 8200. Not sure if that was one of their test systems or something. Since I'm using this on a Gateway computer, I would presume, had this have ever launched, that this would have been a Gateway help and support center or some other OEM. There is some very basic template-y information in here. The help content opens in its own separate window, which I find interesting. There is one final thing in this build that I wanted to show. You know it, DCE. But specifically, this build's DCE is a bit different. Now, I had to look up another YouTube video to figure out how to do this. You need a patched DCE.dll file, which I have acquired. How this works is I had to boot into a different environment to replace that file. In this case, I just used Tyron's boot CD, renamed the old file, added the replacement file, and then I had to run this registry file and restart the computer. toggle the allow dynamic control option, and restart the computer again. And now, DC can be enabled. This build is, as far as I'm aware, the first build that renders glass borders. And it actually seems to run pretty good on this computer, a lot better than the full window transparency. It's an incredibly basic theme. There's definitely some quirks about it, like the icon in the corner being replaced with a Windows flag in every window, and the close, maximize, and minimize buttons not having any outlines, so you kind of just have to hope you're pressing in the right area. But I'm not done yet. If I really wanted to fry my GPU, I could right-click while holding down Shift, which brings up a secret view option to enable 3D view. And this is definitely awesome, even though it makes this thing run like complete trash. Not only is the background completely animated, but file icons are also animated as well. This is just totally awesome. Anyway, now that my computer is cooked, we're going to move on to build 4017, compiled on April 9th, 2003. This is another build that leaked in 2020. I'm beginning to notice a theme here. Amazingly, this is the first build where the EULA actually says Longhorn. It turns out it said Whistler before. I had no idea. It doesn't really matter, like it's a beta version of Windows, but it is really funny. This build has a new messenger tile, which, if I had to guess, this must be similar to what the messenger status tile in those earlier 4000 builds was. Windows Messenger itself has been updated to version 5, which might explain why this messenger tile now seems to work. Another strange change is that the basket tile now shows 0 items instead of 8, and also still causes a crash. Otherwise, that's about it. There were some WinFS changes, but I can't get WinFS to work at all in this build. Build 4020 was compiled on May 7th, and was uploaded to Beta Archive in 2018. An interesting thing about this build is that it's actually a recompile, so there is apparently an older build string in some places in this build. The desktop watermark has been changed. It now just says Longhorn Professional rather than Longhorn XP Professional. This build brings back the people tile for the first time since I don't even know how long. It still brings up the same people picker window from the early Milestone 3 days, pretty much unchanged. This build has a new autoplay wizard. Well, actually, it's been in Longhorn for a while, but I haven't been able to get it to show up. My contacts has a couple other contact places that have been added to it. The preview pane in hardware and devices actually seems to work now, but again, there's even less hardware. You're never going to believe this. The Windows Trust Manager was updated again. The Help and Support Center has pretty much been completely stripped of any sample contents like what were in 4015. And finally, DC can be enabled in this build. You can do either the old full window transparency or glass borders, but it's a different registry tweak than 4015. It's kind of the same story. It works kind of decently actually, but there aren't really any obvious changes with it. One final thing about this build while I was filming it is it completely broke itself. Build 4029 was compiled on June 19th and was leaked on September 14th of the same year. There have been some pretty big changes in the setup utility. At the top of the screen there's a cancel button and a back button, and the upgrade options now have some icons next to them. Otherwise, I had to use an actual physical disk to install this build because for whatever reason my copied files just didn't work at all. So setup took a lot longer than it would have normally with the rest of these builds. The PNP detection thing has been changed. It now says please wait while setup detects your computer's hardware. This can take up to 10 minutes. The text has been placed towards the bottom of the screen rather than the top. This build removes the out-of-box experience introduced in build 4001, which I guess makes sense. They didn't really do anything with it. And instead it just dumps you right into the administrator account. I'm sure you probably also noticed the new logon screen in this build. It's a lot more simple, clean. It has an animated Windows logo, and it asks for Control-Alt-Delete all the time now. In addition to the new logon screen, if you hit Control-Alt-Delete, there's a new Windows Security Options menu that kind of takes you back out to the logon screen. Previously, this is just open Task Manager in Windows XP. You may have noticed that this build's build string is kind of weird. It's in Pig Latin, and apparently that is to test an automated naming system. Previously, every entry that said Windows XP was manual. So this is an automatic system. I guess this is a way to signify that. There have been some theming changes. There's these new kind of blue tabs in various Explorer windows. The window text is no longer centered either, and it's a lot smaller, and the close buttons are kind of different. The clock tile has been updated. It's an entirely new clock face, a more modern looking one, and it looks more proper just in general. The basket tile now seems to work. The people tile does not. The user tile is also back. The Windows Media Player tile is bugged some more. And the slideshow tile now has dedicated play, pause, and fast forward and rewind buttons. The navigation bar is totally different in this build. The back and forward buttons are a lot bigger, but the bar also has the folder name as well as the address bar and a favorites button. And this same change, of course, is present in Internet Explorer. Because the folder name / web page name is so big, that text isn't displayed in the title bar anymore. It creates for a kind of weird look. There's been some changes to the various preview panes. They at least seem to be a bit more proper looking. If you hover over a file, there's now a glass outline. Additionally, if you hold your mouse over something like a picture, a preview will appear. Though the properties window is kind of broken. I got the game library to work somewhat in this build. There's a really temporary preview pane for this. There isn't actually any contents in the folder. In Control Panel, there's a sync manager now. There have also been some more options added to parental controls. You can enable parental auditing of a limited user account and view their activity. I feel like I should take a shot every time I say this sentence. The Windows Trust Manager has been updated once again with probably the most saddest looking window design yet. Also, the help place has been completely nuked. Interestingly though, there's a shortcut for it in the old school help and support center though. Finally, while DCE does not work in this build, there is something that's probably just as interesting called Carousel. It displays all items of a folder in a carousel. This only works out of the box in the hardware and devices folder, but you can amend the registry to make it work in any folder. We can also enable Panorama, which is also a registry tweak. This uses 3D view and organizes things into a line. The interesting thing is that 3D view has been changed and now it's a solid background. The funny thing is that even when you turn off Panorama, 3D view doesn't disable itself, so you can still get it to have spinny icons in any other view. It can also be enabled on the desktop, but the animated background thing that was in 4015 is now just a purple gradient in this build. By enabling this, it made my desktop all weird. There's some more minor changes in this build as well. If you copy a file, there's a new animation thing in that pop-up window. It's just an arrow kind of all over the place. There's a new autoplay design, which includes an animated icon, which I think is pretty cool. Any removable device just has a compact flash icon, while any disk you insert in the system has an optical disc icon. The activation grace period has been changed from 14 days to 60 days. Outlook Express works very well. And the version of Windows Messenger in this build is only usable with an internal Microsoft account. Build 4030 was compiled 1 week later on June 26th and was leaked in, you guessed it. This is the first... Jeez. This is the first leaked build of Longhorn to have a home edition compile as well as a professional compile, or in this case it's called personal. There are a couple changes you would normally associate with a home edition version of Windows, like the default account being owner and a couple options being removed from the start menu, but these aren't Longhorn 4030 specific quirks. Otherwise everything is pretty much the same bugs exist in this build. 1 week after that, on July 3rd, build 4031 was compiled, and this build is professional only, once again. The funny thing is, it lets you upgrade to it, which you shouldn't do, because if you try and upgrade from that, it won't work. There's a new notification style, and, well, actually, this was all the way back in 4020, but I couldn't get any footage of it. There's a file Longhorn bug shortcut on the desktop, which just loads an internal Microsoft site. But this new notification style also allows you to create an exception for notifications, which is interesting. Longhorn entered its Milestone 6 phase with the compilation of build 4029. Wait, what the Yep, there are 2 different versions of this build. Fortunately, it's pretty easy to figure out why, because the 4029 Milestone 5 version that I've already covered was a main branch build, whereas this version of 4029 is a Lab 06 build. Effectively, what this means is that there is a Milestone 5 version and a Milestone 6 version, which is what I'm installing. This isn't just a thing with build 4029, however, because it also happens with build 4030 and 4031, where they have both Milestone 5 versions and Milestone 6 versions. So it can make things pretty confusing when you're referring to these builds, because there's different versions that use the same build number. This 4029 build was compiled 10 days after the Milestone 5 compile on June 29th and was leaked in January of 2020. Because this is a whole new milestone, there are some pretty big changes to this build, like the obvious. This is a whole new desktop wallpaper that's not blue. It does clash with the theme, though, but it still looks pretty interesting. The sidebar tiles no longer show the name of the tile or the icon, with the latter only appearing when you hover over the specific tile. The clock tile now has an alarm option, which when triggered can either bring up a message box or can apparently play a music file. In the start menu, the icon for my computer has been replaced with a totally different Longhorn looking one. In Explorer, the navigation bar is different. It now blends in better with the title bar of a window. The game library is now linked under the library section in my computer. Doesn't work though. On the desktop, there's a shortcut to file a Longhorn bug, which looks suspiciously familiar. Yep, because the Milestone 5 compile of build 4031 was compiled after these Milestone 6 builds were compiled. It also got this file Longhorn bug shortcut. A new sync manager icon has been introduced. Windows search has been overhauled. Same with the search tile, which allows you to search for various things, whether it's files on your machine, or the internet, or contacts, or help questions. And in theory, it would open in the relevant program. If you search in My Stuff, as it's worded, it will just open the search window. But if you have it set to the internet option, it will open in Internet Explorer. And it does actually seem to work, it's just very slow. Another thing introduced in this build is arrow wizards. The only one in this build is the CD writing wizard. Now it's obviously pretty basic in this build, but the point is it was supposed to be an easier to understand wizard by simplifying it and removing a lot of unnecessary text that might be in each wizard. Also just making the wizards more modern looking. And finally, something that's relevant to this computer is that the drivers for the GeForce FX 5200 are now built in. Yay me, I guess. As I alluded to earlier, there is also a Lab 06 compile of build 4030, compiled 1 day after the Lab 06 compile of 4029, and 4 days after the main build of 4030. This build doesn't appear to have anything visually different from the previous 4029 build. The one thing I noticed was there were a lot of driver issues, but fear not, because there actually is a second 4030 compile, meaning there are technically 4 different versions of this build. This one was compiled 3 days later on July 2nd, and 6 days after the main branch compile. And it actually has a couple things I noticed. The game library actually works. No other WinFS thing works, but for some reason the game library does. So you can kind of see what they were trying to go for. And secondly, the Longhorn Help Place is a bit different in this build. It seems to kind of work again. There isn't actually any content that's useful, but again, you can kind of see what they were going for. Finally, the Lab 06 compile of build 4031 was compiled 4 days after the main branch compile on July 7th. And while there isn't really anything that different about this build, there is something that started to happen around this time, sort of the beginning of Milestone 6. If you try and upgrade to this build, there's a pretty good chance it just won't work. Something causes lsass.exe to throw an error, preventing the setup from progressing any further. And this happens pretty much with every Milestone 6 build from this point onwards. It's just impossible to upgrade to them. Normally, you would just get stuck in a boot loop, it would load back to this part of setup, you wouldn't be able to progress any further. But on this computer, it actually corrupted the hard drive, meaning I could no longer boot the setup at all. And upon trying to reinstall Windows on this thing, it totally ruined the partition on the drive. Anyway, when this build isn't completely screwing up my hard drive, WinFS actually seems to work somewhat now, because in addition to the game library, every other library now works and has stuff. This is probably the most functional WinFS has been in a long time, at least in this video. Also, something a bit unusual in this build, in hardware and devices, in addition to the hardware of the computer this is running on, it also has the hardware, from what I can only assume, is the machine that this was imaged on, because it has a CD drive, a hard drive, floppy drive, graphics card, as well as an Ethernet controller, all from a totally different system, which I find really fascinating, even though it was almost certainly a mistake. The Lab 06 team followed up with build 4032, compiled 3 days after this 4031 version on July 10th. There's no main branch compile of this build, I don't think. So at least it is not nearly as confusing when referring to this build. This one was leaked in 2018. And once again, there isn't really anything notably different with this build, except apparently the logon process is now supposed to be faster, probably by disabling unnecessary services or something. However, in the process of doing that, they accidentally disabled the user profiles service and the group policy service. So safe mode is no longer functional at all in this build. So in order for safe mode to work, you have to make some registry tweaks. The first main branch Milestone 6 build was 4033, which was compiled on July 17th and was leaked in 2006. And once again, not really anything obviously different, except another this computer-specific thing, the drivers for the Intel Ethernet controller are now included out of the box. Also, there's some weird problems going on with the icons on the desktop. It's refreshing very rapidly. Before I move on, there was actually another 4033 compile 13 days later on July 30th, But the only version that exists right now, or that's available, is the Itanium version. Do I look like somebody that has that hardware? But from the wiki, it's not really that interesting either. The next x86 build of Longhorn that's available is build 4038 from almost a full month later on August 13th. There have been some changes to the setup in this build because there are dedicated cancel and back buttons at the top of the setup program. The only other button that exists now is the continue button. The other cancel and back buttons were kind of pointless. The upgrade options are now horizontally laid out compared to vertically like they were previously, and there is some computer naming information. When you click on a file in this build, there are now actually tasks that are displayed on the preview pane. There's also been a communication history folder in the library section that does a whole lot of nothing. The Help and Support Center from Windows XP has been removed from the UI and has been replaced with the Assistance Program, which is what the Longhorn Help Place program originally was. It's the same skin, but now there are actually options. Specifically, you can post a question to the Windows Village, or you can email a friend, which opens Outlook Express, and damn, this is looking a lot different. There is also appears to be at least sample help content, but opening more FAQs just opens all tasks. The new file sharing wizard has been updated in this build. It now has the arrow wizard look. And finally, it's time for DCE, something I haven't shown in a long time. Direct 3D shaders are now fixed in this build, so in theory it can be enabled. In reality, it didn't work initially because I was using the built-in Microsoft driver, so instead of working, it completely broke the theming. I ended up having to install my own driver on this for Arrow to actually work. By default, if I run this, the borders of Windows are an opaque gray. I mean, it's different, but it's not Arrow. But glass borders can be enabled in this build. I won't get into how exactly. I'll link some resources down below. The glass theme is similar to how it was all the way back in build 4020, but the glass itself is a bit more transparent. It is still pretty unstable, and a lot of windows just simply do not display properly at all. The next build, 4039, was compiled on August 27th. This build was leaked in 2007. I had to fully reinstall this build too. It wouldn't install over the old build for some reason. There is a notable setup change. There is now a progress bar at the bottom of the screen in the form of 3 steps: collecting information, installing Windows, and final countdown. And I guess depending on what step you're on, the relevant step will be illuminated. There's also a clock, but it doesn't actually do anything, it just is an image. The clock tile in this build displays the current time zone, which is interesting. You can also change the time zone directly from the tile itself. And you can also just name it whatever you want. The Windows Media Player tile has been redesigned again. Once again, it throws a crash and doesn't really work, except for the eject button, which actually does eject the optical drives on the computer, which I wasn't really expecting. Instead of being able to open a file with this tile, the only thing that comes up is this text saying to be implemented in Milestone 7. There are also some slideshow tile options. You can set some animations now, view the photo in a photo viewer, or view it in full screen. In the start menu, the My Computer icon has been reverted back to the Windows XP icon, though the default user profile picture is now the MSN Messenger one. In the Explorer navigation bar, there's been some new icons. The back and forward buttons have a different design, so does the Favorites button. The forward button is also smaller than the back button, which I find a bit interesting, probably because you're more likely to use the back button. Of course, the same change is present in Internet Explorer. And next to the Favorites button, there are shortcuts for search and command prompt. Buried in the Windows folder, there is a new media player in this build called Floating Player. It's actually supposed to be called Longhorn Media Player. though it doesn't work at all in this build. Finally, something a bit random, the title.wma legacy welcome music file that would have played in the Windows XP out-of-box experience is now the Windows XP welcome music. Previously, since 3683, it had been some other thing, but for some reason they changed it back to the Windows XP music. Not really sure why. It's not used at all in this build, but they felt the need to do that. However, the 4039 fun doesn't end here, because there actually exists another compile of this build from 3 days earlier on August 24th, also a Lab 06 build. This build was leaked in the virus year, and it apparently comes from Microsoft's internal IT department, and includes several beta applications pre-installed. It does mean that the ISO for this build is about double the size, and also takes a lot longer to install, and a lot longer to boot up. I timed it at almost 10 minutes. Before we get into the fun stuff, this build has a volume tile which does nothing, and DCE in this build is apparently a lot more stable than it was in 4038, or interestingly, the later compile of this build. Alright, finally, the goods. This build has a full version of Office 2003 build 5329. There is a version of eTrust antivirus included, which is what slows down this build a lot, and uninstalling it or disabling it will help the speed issues a lot. There is Microsoft Product Studio, which completely broke the DCE theme, HTML Help Workshop, Microsoft Visual Source Safe 2004, Microsoft Visual Studio codename WIDBE, I think that's how you say that, build 30703.17, and there is also a hang reporting tool, probably for good reason. Moving on, build 4040 was compiled 1 day after the second compile of 4039, on August 28th. And the most notable thing about this build is actually the build lab. Every build up until this point had either been a main branch build or a Lab 06 build. This build is a Lab 04 build. Lab 06 is user interface, so it makes sense that that's the most that exists. Lab 04 is apparently terminal services. So because this isn't Lab 06, its code is older, so a lot of the changes over the last few builds aren't visible at all in this build. The final Milestone 6 build at the moment is build 4042, which was compiled on September 5th. And we're back to the main branch of builds, so once again, a lot of the 4039 changes are just totally absent in this build. In fact, it's basically just like 4040. The only notable change is that safe mode now works again because those critical services are enabled by default. I gotta say, the sidebar looks very interesting in the classic theme. Now, the first Milestone 7 build of Longhorn is also build 4042. Yep, there's a Milestone 6 compile of 4042 and a Milestone 7 one. So to recap, the beginning of Milestone 6 also had Milestone 5 versions, and the end of Milestone 6 had a Milestone 7 version. Anyway, this build was compiled 4 days later on September 9th, and it's a lot more well known than the main compile of 4042. This one leaked in 2011. And there's a lot of major changes in this build. It's not apparent at first because the setup is pretty much the same, but the boot screen has been changed to a new one, which now says Windows codename Longhorn and has an orange progress bar rather than a blue progress bar. The auto text screen in this build also has a different color scheme. Still the same layout, just with different colors. The logon screen is very different in this build. It's the same layout as the previous builds, but the background has been replaced with a blue gradient. The Windows logo is now the Windows XP logo as well. And the theme it uses is not Plex, but a new theme called Slate, which is the new visual style in this build that replaces Plex. It's also supposed to be a temporary theme, but you can see it looks a lot more proper, a lot less blue. It looks more or less like the Windows XP theme, just in a different color, and also with orange accents, which explains the boot screen. There are obviously still some Plex remnants, like the setup and the WinVer banner, which is still the old Plex one. Another thing different in this build is that the Pig Latin strings are gone, and they're a lot more normal looking now. The sidebar has been changed, all the tiles match the Plex theme now, and there are a lot less tiles than the previous build. In fact, the only tiles that are here at all are the tray icons, the clock, the people tile, quick launch, slideshow, and sync. All the others are gone. Other than the clock tile, probably the other most significant tile change is the people tile, which has a new pick a contact window. In the start menu, the My prefix has been dropped from pretty much every system folder, so rather than having My Computer or My Documents, it's just Documents and Computer, except for the old My Documents folder and My Contacts. The preview banners in a lot of these folders have also been changed, except for the Games one, which is just Games. You may notice the navigation and title bar are finally unified. They look like one thing, not two different resources. The command prompt button has also been removed from the navigation bar. The computer window has a default store shortcut, which does a whole lot of nothing. There have also been some changes to the arrow wizards present in this build, specifically the ones I could find, the burn to disk wizard as well as the sharing wizard. There are also supposed to be a couple more arrow wizards in this build, but I couldn't figure out a way to get them to appear. This build has a sticky notes application buried in a really weird spot. At first, if you try and double click on it, it does nothing. Apparently, what you're supposed to do is to make a new text document and drag that into the sticky notes application, and then it opens a sticky note. A really weird way of doing that, but I guess it works. You may remember in some of the earliest builds of Longhorn that had the tablet PC components, there was also a sticky note program, but that was basically just ripped straight from XP Tablet PC Edition. This is a totally different one. The Longhorn media player also opens in this build. It's not really functional at all, but you can see it takes on a very similar design to the media player tile that's been present in many of these builds. A couple other quirks. Outlook Express is completely broken in this build. Windows Messenger is once again Microsoft internal only. And lastly, I noticed the CPU usage in this build was really unusually high. Turns out it was caused by the sticky note program. Now the next build is 4048, compiled on September 25th. However, this build is another 4011 situation because there were some problems with the original ISO. It's actually a lot worse this time. The original ISO wasn't imaged correctly, so there are just a ton of files completely missing, making it impossible to install. There are still ways to install this build. The ISO I have is another i386 repack, which uses files from a future build we're going to talk about in a minute. Thus, I can't install it over the existing build, and once again, I have no burnable media. So unlike build 4011, build 4048 was a lot more difficult to install. It took a very, very long time. For whatever reason, on my desktop computer, the virtual machine was just incredibly slow. The installation ended up taking a couple hours, and it threw numerous file copying errors. I'm not sure if that's just my VM behaving strange, or if that's how this build is. This ISO is missing a lot of catalog files, so in the hardware detection phase, there's a lot of driver installation issues. Basically, you have to manually accept every single device on the system. And unfortunately, it didn't even work at all. About the most that I get is it'll boot up to this screen, and that's it. it won't log in any further. It just gets hung up here. I've tried everything I can with this. Probably so many files weren't copied right that it's just broken. So this is all we get to look at. It's not like there's a lot in this build anyway, but there is one change, and that's what you're looking at right now. The logon screen gradient is gone. It's simply just a black screen with a Windows flag over it, which is certainly different, but personally I don't really mind it either way. But yeah, there's not really a lot to this one otherwise. I've used this exact ISO before and gotten this to install just fine, so I'm not really sure why this was behaving this way, but whatever. The next build that I can actually install is 4050, compiled on September 28th. And this build has a new auto run screen and a whole different setup utility. Both of these things are Slate themed. Now I say this build introduced some, it's not exactly clear if these were present in build 4048. In fact, likely they were, but since the original ISO just doesn't work, we'll never know. It's pretty much about the same layout as the old setup. The one difference, other than the different color scheme, is there is a clean install summary page which has not only the installation location as well as the computer name. There are also other things like being able to select the user accounts and the time zones. You can't actually do anything with it, they're grayed out, but the options technically are there. Personally, I like this setup screen a lot more than the old Plex style Longhorn ones. It's just a lot easier on the eyes. There are a couple issues with the setup in this build. Mainly, there is an issue with AGP440.sys, so if you try and use this build on anything Intel 440 related, it won't work. I had this happen on VMware. The only way I've ever been able to use this build has been to use it on real hardware. Less catastrophically, if you do use it on a real computer, at some point during the hardware detection phase of setup, if you have a PC speaker, it will play a long beep, which I managed to catch on video. Who knows why? Now this build is also only available in the Home Edition SKU, so it's a similar situation to build 4030 where there are some small changes, but they're mostly to do with it being a Home Edition version rather than the professional version. This is also a PDC build of Longhorn, so it isn't possible to upgrade to it. And a difference with this setup is that in addition to the Windows folders being renamed, the Documents and Settings and Program Files folders are also renamed to something else, and the setup makes entirely new folders when you're doing a clean install. Also, the default store folder in this build opens to stuff that I really don't think I should be seeing. The Communication History folder has also been removed. The Longhorn Help and Support Center has some Avalon errors if you try and open it. It also appears to have sample content again, but it's really buggy in this build. Here's something else I randomly noticed in this build. There's a new file transfer wizard that I don't believe has been introduced in this build. It was introduced at some point before, but I only noticed it here. Anyway, I just thought it was kind of interesting. This wizard is still very much in beta. Something else I was able to get working in this build, the device sync arrow wizard. A couple other things. The animated auto run icon that was introduced ages ago now has a black border around it. It's not transparent anymore. They did at least add a new icon for USB drives though, so I guess there's that. Also, the people tile has been removed, bringing the total amount of tiles down to just 5. Now the next build is 4051, compiled 3 days later on October 1st. And the interesting thing about this build is that it is the official PDC 2003 build that was distributed to attendees, making it the first build of Longhorn that's actually been intentionally distributed. Because of this, there isn't really a lot actually new in this build, mostly just some bug fixes. Notably, there is also an x64 compile of this build, as well as an Itanium version. About the only other notable thing is that, like 4050, this is an IDX build, meaning it's been recompiled. The next build after that is 4053, compiled on October 22nd. This build was leaked in 2004, and it is actually possible to upgrade to it. Meaning this is the first build probably since the beginning of Milestone 6 where you can actually upgrade to it without it completely breaking everything. To be fair, this may have been possible in build 4048, but again, we'll probably never know. And once again, there's not really anything notable. This is the first main branch build of Milestone 7. The File a Longhorn bug shortcut has returned, and Outlook Express is usable again after being broken previously. The next leaked build of Milestone 7, and the final Milestone 7 build, wouldn't be compiled for another 7 months after this. There probably are other builds that exist in between this period of time, but they aren't leaked. Except for one, 4067, which unfortunately is the second and final Itanium-only build of Longhorn. And this one's a bit unfortunate because there actually are some notable changes in this build, but I can't run it. So we'll have to cover them in the next x86 build, which is 4074. You probably know this build. It is likely the most famous build of Longhorn. It was compiled on April 25th, 2004, and was distributed at WinHEC 2004, making it the second build of Longhorn that was intentionally distributed. Because there was a 7th month gap, we're effectively going to treat 4067 as not existing for this video. There's a lot going on in this build. First of all, the desktop wallpaper has been replaced. Instead of the ripe field wallpaper introduced in 4042, we now have a leaves wallpaper. We'll start with sidebar tile changes. The clock tile has been moved to the bottom of the sidebar. There's also a lot more tiles now. The basket tile is back, the contacts tile is back. There is a news feed tile, a notification history tile, people nearby, as well as a search tile, in addition to all the others that were in previous builds. There have also been a lot of new icons introduced throughout the operating system, a lot more modern looking, and some you may even recognize. The shutdown options are totally different, including a recommend best turnoff option selection. The categorization and control panel is all screwed up. Nearly all of the options and parental controls have been removed, except for the limit the games they can play selection. The communication history folder has returned. The preview pane is also smaller in this build, with more emphasis on the actual options that are on it. I don't know how after all this time, but they still can't get a proper preview pane for the games library. WinFS does not work out of the box in this build. You can supposedly enable its services, which will make it work, but this didn't work for me. The notifications in this build are styled a bit differently, and the exceptions window has been replaced with this rules and alerts window, which looks a lot different. Kind of has the arrow wizard look, but it's not quite the same thing. But if that's not good enough for you, what about a whole new theme? Yep, not long after the Slate theme was introduced, there is a second theme that isn't enabled by default called Jade. By enabling this, the default font is changed to Sego UI. The start menu is also different. The user account name and picture is actually totally absent from this start menu too. And the window borders are more silver than gray. And when you maximize on a window, the borders become black. Interesting. Perhaps this might come up again later. If you disable the sidebar, there's also a new gray taskbar as well. It's pretty basic and doesn't even really match the start menu at all. The Help and Support Center has a new skin on it. Once again, there is some sample information, and you can apparently rate how helpful that information was. In this build, there's a program called Buddy Matchmaker, which is one of the game's options. It doesn't actually work very well in this build, and it was present As far back as build 4042, I just couldn't get it to open at all. But it would in theory allow you to send messages to contacts on your machine or invite said contacts to play a game. But yeah, it just usually causes a crash. Oh yeah, also, there's new error boxes in this build, including one for when a program closes, or if a driver's not compatible. There's a couple more as well, but these are the only ones I could get to work. There's also a new scheduled tasks program in the control panel, as well as a speech recognition program buried in the program files folder, and a beta volume control window which doesn't actually have any visible text. Now it's time for one of the most interesting things about this build. Do I even need to say it? So DC in this build is a similar situation to build 4038. By default, you can enable it, but the borders it produces are weird. In this case, they are technically transparent, but they are a pretty awful shade of green. It does at least have some animations though, the first time it's been present at all since early full window DCE. Of course, glass borders are possible in this build. I found the files from this Internet Archive link, and it was kind of a pain to get this working. It was a lot of work. Among my modifications, I was able to get the preview pane in Explorer to be animated, which is awesome. And after removing some sidebar stuff because it broke everything, I was able to get arrow stars working, which technically doesn't need DCE, but again, the better the GPU you have, the better time you're going to have. It's just some animated stars that move around your desktop. Alright, I know what you're here for. So, it's very buggy, but here you go. The glass theme is very different in this build. The taskbar and sidebar also have a glass theme as well, you may have noticed. It's fully animated as well. The close, maximize, and minimize buttons now actually have outlines so you know where to press them. When you maximize a window, whenever it loads, you'll notice that all of the glass elements become opaque, like what happened with the Jade theme. My GPU certainly was crying for help with all of this running, but it is really cool, even if it runs horribly on this GPU. There were a couple smaller honorable mentions with this build as well. By default, it isn't possible to create a folder in this build because the registry entry is missing. The version of Windows Messenger in this build is now 6.1. Two different help pane windows can be found in the System32 folder. The animated icon on the auto-run window clearly must have chugged a Red Bull or something. And if you toggle Show Hidden Files or Folders, a Help and Support icon and a Search icon will appear on the desktop alongside the Recycle bin. Now that being said, there is a lot with this build that I haven't discussed, primarily to save time. But if it wasn't already clear, this is a pretty buggy build of Longhorn. A lot of stuff still does not work. There's a lot of smaller issues still going on with this build. It had been over 7 months since the last build, and there still really weren't a lot of improvements. There were new things, but there weren't a lot of improvements. At this point in time, Longhorn had been in development for allegedly almost 3 years at this point, and this operating system still was nowhere near ready to ship. And it was clear that things were getting significantly worse. The first Milestone 8 build, or apparently Milestone 8 is disputed or something, I don't know, but I'm gonna call it Milestone 8 to make everything simple. The first Milestone 8 build is 4081, compiled on May 3rd, 2004. And this is the first componentized build of Longhorn. Essentially what this did is it made the features in each build basically packages that were all located in a central repository, and for each SKU it would call for the relevant packages for that SKU. At least I think that's the idea. The reality of why they did it is to cut down on the amount of things that were in this build. Basically, to try and make it better, which is exactly the opposite of what really happened. In my opinion, Milestone 8 builds are among probably the worst, but especially these 408X builds that I'm about to go through are some of the most difficult builds to deal with. How about we start with the fact that if you try and install this build over an existing copy, like if you don't fully format the hard drive, there's a good chance it'll just completely nuke the partition. It'll throw this green screen of death with a fat file system error, and good luck trying to read any data on the partition after this happens, because you can't. In addition, and I wish I got a recording of this, the hard drive in the computer started making absolutely awful noises. And I didn't even try and upgrade to it. You can't. It's not possible. For this reason, I actually do have a physical disc of this build, because it's basically the only way I found that you can install it on a real system. And after waiting a long time, it'll eventually get to the desktop. Just really slowly. The various contacts tiles have been removed in this build. In fact, a lot of things have been removed in this build. Yup, most of the packages weren't added to the component manifests, so they weren't installed and are absent in this build. So not only is this build incredibly buggy, it's missing most of the things in Windows. Some of them include optical drives being characterized as hard drives, device manager being missing, so good luck with any driver installs, random unlabeled things in the control panel, whatever this means, and WordPad failing to create an empty document. To be fair, a lot of these things that were in Windows before you can still find in the System32 folder, they're just not linked at all in the UI. Now from this point on, I'm going to go through every future build about as quickly as I can, because other than the final Longhorn build, which we will get to, pretty much none of these builds have anything remarkable about them. They're all basically the same, starting with 4082, compiled 1 week later on May 10th. I should point out that in some of these builds, there's going to be display issues, particularly my display capture is slightly off-centered. This is a problem that can happen with my capture card, a problem that hasn't happened so far because I've had my own driver that I know doesn't cause this problem. Because I can't get a device manager to replace the built-in driver, this is what I'm stuck with. The next build, 4083, was compiled on May 16th, and interestingly, in addition to the x86 compile, there is also an AMD 64 compile. So, woohoo. And this one introduces a new wallpaper called Tree. It also has the device manager again, with a lot of things missing. And also this fun bug where sometimes the sidebar just breaks everything. Build 4084 was compiled on May 27th. Drivers installed in this build now must be Authenticode signed. Also, Windows Messenger is now version 6.0 again. And the Sounds applet is back. Build 4085 was compiled on June 3rd, and now my floppy drive shows up as a hard drive as well. But wait, I'm not done yet, because there was another 4085 compile, a Lab 07 compile. Lab 07 apparently was Internet Information Services /Com Plus. Cool. Scheduled tasks are back in the control panel. Build 4086 was compiled on June 15th, and this one just completely stopped doing anything during the setup. Fortunately, because none of the pre-installation environment files were deleted, I was able to boot back into that and load the setup again through the command prompt, which did the trick. Yeah, you can actually upgrade between these builds, but occasionally it will just get hung up somewhere and then you'll have to clean install anyway. Scheduled tasks now actually does stuff again with this really interesting window. But wait, there's another 4086 compile as well, this time a Lab 03 build. Server The hardware detection phase has some fun new text, I guess, indicating this process may take an hour to finish, and although it may appear to hang, setup is still running. This is very important. It should have been introduced a while ago. This one takes a while to log in or shut down. The next build, oh, would you believe it, is 4086. Did you think I was done yet? Nope. There's also a Lab 01 compile of this build too. This one is kernel. I swear I'm not losing my mind. This one was compiled on, oh goody, July 4th. It now has some proper drivers again, including the integrated audio controller driver for my computer. And build 4087 was a main branch compile, so was compiled way before the last couple 4086 versions on June 26th. Now, next build after that is 4088. It's the last 408X build, and unlike the other ones, it actually has a couple of interesting things about it. This build was uploaded to Beta Archive in 2015, and it's a lab. This one is networking. It was compiled on July 6th, and it's the most functional 408X build. Not that that's really saying much of anything. The most interesting thing is a lot of things that were absent are now added back in. The autoplay icon is no longer animated, but at least it looks kind of like proper again. And this build has DCE. It's apparently been completely rewritten in .NET code. It's also maybe the least functional version of DCE in any Longhorn build, which really kind of sums up how Longhorn was going so far. As I alluded to earlier, by this point in time, it had already been a long time since Longhorn started development. Again, allegedly 3 years, and nearly 2 years of confirmed builds. And there are probably even more from before September of 2002. So it's safe to say Longhorn has been in development for a long time. And this project was still nowhere near release. And it had already been delayed once at this point. Remember, this was supposed to release in late 2003. It was clear that Longhorn was just becoming too much. There were too many things that were added that weren't actually being finalized at all. The OS was still unstable, buggy, and just a broken mess. This project was just taking too long. Something had to be done. The last milestone 8, and the final build of Longhorn, was 4093. It was leaked in 2006, and the ISO is interesting because it used a pre-installation environment from apparently build 4033. A fixed ISO has been uploaded since then, but I've hung on to this old original leak build because I think it's just kind of interesting. It's a bit more unique over the rest of the builds. And again, I do have a physical disc of this build, just kind of felt significant enough to warrant it. And also, this is the largest build of Longhorn other than the weird 4039 compile with all of the extra programs bundled in. This ISO is over 1 gigabyte. Every build until this point was close-ish to fitting on a CD. This one's not even close. Perhaps intentionally, since they probably knew that this was going to be the last build of Longhorn. There are some interesting things in this build. You may also recognize it. I did a whole video trying to use this build by installing programs and drivers and stuff on a real system. Dumb idea, because this build is, bad. This build has pretty much every slideshow tile that they had previously used at all. There's a couple absent ones, like the desktop manager ultimately never made a return. There's also a new display tile, which if you try and enable it, it will just break Explorer instead. The clock tile is now back at the top of the sidebar. The Windows Media Player tile has been redesigned. There's a sound icon on the taskbar that I don't believe you can get rid of. It just brings up sound properties. Maybe they still needed a way to control the volume. The Photos and Videos library has this new, I guess it's a view option selector thing. I have no idea what this is. It's not implemented. It's only in this library. The Contacts library has no preview pane at all anymore. And after like 40-something builds at this point, they couldn't once get a proper looking games preview pane. Hardware and Devices works again, though pretty much everything in it is generic. There are some more libraries linked again in Explorer after being absent for so long. There's also a random all items thing, which just loads nothing, and an unlabeled system folder, which can't be displayed. The Burn to Disk wizard has been changed again. It's extremely simple now. There is a new speech recognition window in Control Panel, which I would assume is probably a tutorial to the speech recognition program found in 4074, which also produces an unexpected error. There's a text-to-speech window in Control Panel as well, which kind of seems like it works. In System 32, there is an application called LH Desk, which brings up a Display Properties window. That's right, for the first time since 3718, Milestone 3, there is a new Display Properties window. And just like the old one, basically everything just links to the old window, except for display settings, which I don't want to mess with. There's also a program called Power CPL, which is a power settings window, which actually does seem to have some settings, but I tested it, they don't actually do anything. There's also WP Wizard, which is a wireless presentation wizard. In the Program Files folder, there is a new version of Movie Maker, specifically Movie Maker 3. The Longhorn Media Player is also present in this build. There's also supposed to be some new dialogues for Windows product activation. However, they just didn't work. The shutdown options are also different in this build. There's a new dialogue window for that as well. And for one final time, I thought I should try DCE on this build. Once again, this completely broke the sidebar. It's still extremely glitchy like it was in 4088, but at least it's a bit more proper looking. There's at least some glass borders now. The sidebar and taskbar are also transparent. It's not an ugly shade of green. But yeah, that's it. 4 hours and 29 minutes after this build was compiled, the unthinkable happened? I don't know. The next build of Longhorn, 3790, was compiled with a distinct lack of everything they had done up until this point. Development on Longhorn had officially been reset to 0. This was the first and so far the only time in Microsoft history where a version of Windows had just gone so wrong that they had to scrap it and start again. So, what the hell happened here? It's been almost 21 years since all of this happened. I could tell you what I think, or I could just tell you what we already know. This project suffered from too much ambition, compounded with management problems, all resulting in feature creep. The goalpost kept getting pushed further and further away. A big observation that I have made after years and years of tinkering with these builds on various things, it really feels to me like there was just a lack of a clear direction as to what to do with this project. They certainly didn't have a lack of ideas for what to do with this. Remember, this was supposed to be a minor release, but became so big that it over time became the next big thing. But they didn't actually know what to do with all of that, pretty much making it all useless. A good idea is only good if you can execute it well. And they just couldn't here. Every time they introduced a new feature in this build, it seems they would either do nothing with it afterwards, remove it straight away, or they would completely rework it or redesign it again and again and again. One of the best examples to me is the Windows Trust Manager user interface, which ended up not being in later builds, but in the earlier Milestone 3, 4, and 5 builds that it was in, it kept getting redesigned practically every build, and every time they did it, it ended up being worse off afterwards. And that's just one thing. In fact, I really thought about this hard, I honestly can't think of anything in this that was finished. Any of the obvious core things that they introduced are still pretty much just placeholders, or are so broken that they're not useful in any way. So I think it's safe to say, if we assume that Microsoft were to fix this as best as they could, if they were to keep working on this project and get it done right, I think it would have taken at least 3 more years, if not more. And they probably would have had to cut things to make this work. And I think that's being generous. There's a solid chance that it would have taken maybe longer than that, or the more likely scenario, this would have just never come out at all. And I feel like even if they did eventually get this figured out, even if they had a 2006 or 2007 release, or maybe even something after that, I feel like that this would have still been a disastrous launch when this would come out. If we come back to reality for a second, we all know how much of a disaster Windows Vista's launch was. I feel like Longhorn's launch would be even worse than how Vista's went. By August of 2004, it had been almost 3 years since the compilation of the RTM build of Windows XP. It was already one of the longest development periods for a version of Windows, especially a consumer-oriented version of Windows. Around the same time, Apple had made significant gains with Mac OS X, and in a lot of ways making it straight up better than Windows XP. And they didn't exactly hesitate at the opportunity to poke fun at Microsoft for this, as well as how long it was taking Longhorn to be developed. And as always, Linux was also making pretty big gains, with distros like Ubuntu releasing around this time, a distro meant to be a more user-friendly Linux experience and definitely a competitor to Windows XP. Microsoft needed to get their act together, and they needed to get their act together now. They needed a solution. Ultimately, the idea that was floated, and later what they would end up doing, was to use the Windows Server codebase for Longhorn's development. Up until now, Longhorn had been developed using the Windows XP codebase pretty much as a direct successor. And one of the biggest problems with this is that the Windows XP codebase kinda sucks. People may have a lot of nostalgia for Windows XP these days, but back when it was a new OS in its first few years, it was rough. Service Packs 1 and 2 for Windows XP were made/released around the same time as Longhorn's development. People were being pulled away from Longhorn to make Windows XP better, especially with security. So switching away to a different code base, one that would be more stable and work just better overall, seems like the smart move. Obviously, we already covered this a little bit ago, but the same day as build 4093's compilation, 3790 was compiled, which is basically just Windows Server 2003 with the Windows XP user interface. However, they had already been working on this beforehand as early as August 3rd with the compilation of build 5000, because it just seemed like there was going to be no way to fix Longhorn. This was just not going to work. It would have probably taken just as much time, if not less time, to start over and make something new, which is ultimately what they did. As we know, Windows Vista would rise from the ashes of Longhorn, being completed in late 2006 and releasing on January 30th, 2007. And while it wasn't the exact same thing as Longhorn, with features definitely being cut, it also incorporated a lot of ideas originally in Longhorn, and it was about the closest thing that we were going to get to Longhorn. Windows Vista's development only actually took about 2 years. It's just that there was that period of time where they were stuck on Longhorn, meaning the gap between Windows XP and Vista was over 5 years. So yeah, that is a very condensed version of the story of Longhorn. Before I go, there's one last thing that I wanted to get into. Throughout this video, I've been collecting some data on these builds in a couple areas, and I thought I would include it in this video. For this, I have whipped up a couple basic charts in Microsoft Office that should get the point across. Let's start with RAM usage. Memory leaks were a big problem with Longhorn, with many critical services, especially WinFS, leaking RAM like crazy. So I thought it would be interesting to track this throughout each build. Build 4011 is excluded from this because its numbers didn't make any sense compared to the rest of this, and 4048 is excluded because I couldn't even get it installed in the first place. I also took the memory usage from Windows XP RTM before I installed any build on this computer. Not a single one of these builds was able to match the numbers from Windows XP, which just kind of makes sense. The closest is build 4001 at just over 330 megabytes of RAM used. I should note that these numbers were taken after I was done filming each segment, so it's not really fair because obviously some of these builds were left on a lot longer than others. In the case of builds that were boring, I would usually leave them powered up for a little while just to kind of let the machine warm up, and then I would take a number from there. If this chart illustrates anything, it's a lack of consistency between these builds. A wildcard in this is if WinFS was functioning or not at all in certain builds, like in early Milestone 4, where WinFS didn't work for me, so the RAM usage was a lot lower. RAM isn't a problem at all on this computer. Like I said, this has 4 gigabytes of RAM. All of these would run fine if this computer had 1 gig of RAM, but a couple of these builds, it would definitely be getting a bit uncomfortable. The build with the highest RAM usage, unsurprisingly, is 4074 at close to 900 megabytes of RAM being used. There's a couple other outliers from before this, but typically these builds would hover around 500 to 600 megabytes or so. So 1 gigabyte of RAM would be fine for this, but that wasn't the norm back in 2003/4 when these builds were compiled. So it's no wonder that they certainly struggled a bit more. The most consistency in any of these builds is actually the Milestone 8 builds compiled after 4074, where there was componentization, and with most of the things being missing, the RAM usage was a lot lower. Even in 4093 with more stuff added to it again, it didn't crack anywhere near even Milestone 5 builds. The next chart is startup time, another big problem of Longhorn. So I wanted to measure how long it took from the BIOS logo appearing to the computer booted to the desktop, ready to use. Once again, there is a lack of any real consistency here. It's also not really a scientific test. It differs between some builds, so some builds may boot up pretty quickly, but they may not be usable for a couple more minutes, while others may boot up a lot quicker. So what I decided to do was to set it to start up Internet Explorer when the computer boots, so that way it had something to actually load, and when it seemed like it was ready to use, that's when I stopped the timer. The vertical y-axis on this chart can be ignored. It doesn't really make any sense. Excel kind of sucks with durations like this, but anyway, this chart is heavily skewed because of the 4039 compile with all the extra programs and stuff in it, causing its startup time to be way longer at almost 10 minutes to boot up. So when we remove that from the chart, it starts to look a bit more readable. Once again, there is a lack of consistency here. Not a single build was able to match the boot up time from Windows XP. The closest was 4020, taking 1 minute and 10 seconds to boot up. There's a lot of builds that were around the same time, about a minute and a half or so. Other builds took closer to 2 minutes. Specifically around milestone 7, this started becoming commonplace. I expected 4074 to be the longest one once again, but he was actually beaten by a couple milestone 8 builds, 4082, 4083, and 4084, with the Lab 07 compile of 4085, the Lab 03 compile of 4086, and 4093 taking almost the same amount of time as it took 4074 to boot up. Speaking of time, I measured the install time for each one of these builds. For this, I don't have any data for Windows XP because I didn't actually install it on video, but on this computer it takes roughly 15 minutes or so. And for this, you can definitely see a big difference in the builds that used cab-based installers, mainly the Milestone 3 builds and 4002, compared to the builds that use the new Windows image format. It makes a big difference. 4001 took just 8 minutes to do a clean install. Granted, some of these were also upgrades, not clean installs, but it didn't really seem to make that much of a difference. Overall, none of these builds really took too long to install. Most of them took just over 15 to 20 minutes. 4050 took almost half an hour. That one was one of the slowest builds up until this point. Things start getting rough though when we move on to the componentized builds. Not a single one of these builds took less than half an hour to install, and they quickly took longer and longer, with the Lab 07 compile of 4085 and the Lab 03 compile of 4086 once again taking over an hour to install. Keep in mind that performance metrics are going to vary based on the machine you use. The computer I'm using is a pretty good computer to run this on. It's got a pretty fast CPU, lots of RAM, and a pretty modern fast hard drive. On a more era-appropriate PC, or even something like, for example, my Dimension 8100, these builds are going to take a lot longer at starting up and installing. I've had plenty of computers where some of the later Milestone 8 builds particularly take literally 3 to 4 hours sometimes to install, which is wild. Finally, for a bit of fun, I put in the ISO size of each build. 4011 and 4048 are included here, but honestly, they really shouldn't have been. Their numbers aren't really comparable at all. They're totally different file structures. So anyway, this is probably the most consistent part of Longhorn. They're all slightly bigger than my Windows XP RTM disk, though that also kind of just depends on the specific media. In general, they hover around being able to fit on a CD with no problem. In fact, most of these can. Some of the Milestone 6 builds probably can't. 4074 goes just slightly over it. The only real outliers here is the 4039 compile with all the software, meaning it's about double the size of a typical build, which kind of makes sense, and 4093 being just over 1 gigabyte, perhaps because they added a bunch of stuff in. You can also see the drop off in size for the Milestone 8 builds that are lacking pretty much anything, meaning that their ISO size is about half of a typical Longhorn build, until about 4088 when it starts to be more realistic again. So because of this, 4082 is the smallest build of Longhorn at about 340 megabytes. But excluding these builds, the next smallest build would be 3706 at just under 500 megabytes. So now I think we're done here. One final thing before I go. While a lot of the things I demonstrated in this video are honestly just things that I have found in Longhorn over the years, a lot of things that were demonstrated were also found using other resources. Specifically, betawiki.net was a big source of information for this video. It contains detailed information on every single one of these builds and contained a lot of stuff that I had no idea was even in Longhorn, as well as longhorn.ms, which is a more Longhorn focused site that also contains a lot of information. It was extremely helpful, primarily in getting DCE working in some of these builds. If you want more information on Longhorn, on things that I missed, or want an actual explanation on things compared to what I provided, I would highly encourage you to go and check out those sites. I'll link them down below.